Here we are with Mono-White Hatebears, and it looks like we've got a one land hand on the draw, so can't afford to potentially miss our second land drop on 7 cards. So we're going to go ahead and ship this one. And a playable 6-card hand. Angel of Jubilation. 4 mana 3/3 flyer. It can pump our squad. Stops our opponent from sacrificing creatures potentially. And then even Mind Sensor. So this would be a pretty good hand against something like a Collected Company type deck. So we'll keep it. Gonna go ahead and bottom the Ghost Quarter. We've already got 4 lands. So we're looking for action primarily, since Angel of Jubilation is pretty much the top of the mana curve here. And so it looks like we're about to see what our opponent's up to here. Serum Visions could mean Storm or Delver. Normally, when I see a Serum Visions and a Scalding Tarn, I am thinking about blue-red. And there's a couple different blue-red archetypes in the format, so shouldn't matter too much. Thalia, it would be a great draw, great card to have in our hand against Storm, potentially, if that's what we're up against. But since our opponent just passed his turn on 2 lands, maybe it's not Storm. Either way, we're going to want to just go ahead and play Thalia. It could be our opponent has a counterspell or lightning bolt or something of that nature. And yeah, it is going to be lightning bolt, which means that our opponent could still be on a Delver deck or some other sort of blue-red deck. We haven't seen any creatures or any... Okay, so now we see Drowned Catacombs, actually. So we've entered the realm of 3 colors. And our draw was Leonin Arbiter, so we have drawn a couple of spells here. And so we could just play the Arbiter here, but in many ways it makes more sense to just go ahead and hold up Aven Mind Sensor and just pass the turn. So let's go ahead and go with that line here. And the reason why we're doing this is it stops our opponent from using a removal spell on our end of turn to just kill our Arbiter and then untap and do something. It looks like we're up against some sort of Grixis control deck. So potentially, yes, Cryptic Command is a card we're worried about here, but at the same time, I don't think we can afford to just wait on this Aven Mind Sensor. We don't have that many threats. The Angel of Jubilation is our most significant one, but all of these creatures die to Lightning Bolt, die to Terminate, die to a variety of removal spells our opponent could have in their deck. And we're up against 5 cards in hand. It looks like right now our opponent is considering possibly a counterspell like Cryptic Command. So we'll see what happens. And so there is the Cryptic Command. So kind of unfortunate. But we can untap and just play Angel of Jubilation, which is reasonable here. It's not the best threat against a Grixis deck that has a number of ways to deal with this Angel, but we're just going to go ahead and run it out there and hope for the best at this point. Not really the matchup for Mono-White Hatebears here. One of the worst matchups for the deck. That being said, we're kind of hoping our opponent doesn't have a lot of removal. Now we're playing open-faced, essentially. Our opponent knows exactly what's going on in our hand. And it does seem like our opponent may not have drawn any threat like a Gurmag Angler or Tasigur or something like that. So we may have some time to set up. But at the same time, we're kind of relying on this Angel of Jubilation and potentially Eldrazi Displacer to get in damage. So that may or may not happen. And Snapcaster Mage is very bad news. That this means that the Lightning Bolt's gonna come back and just trade off with our Angel here. And it looks like, yeah, our opponent's just gone ahead and done this in their main phase. So, hoping for something. Aether Vial, not really what we wanted to see, but let's just go ahead and cast it plus the Displacer in our hand that our opponent already knew about. And since our opponent knew about the Displacer and chose not to take it with Inquisition, that likely means that our opponent has access to a removal spell for this Displacer as well. But we'll see if that's the case. It is going to be a Terminate. And so, kind of hoping to draw more gas. We've gotten pretty lucky, actually, to draw mostly spells. But now, because of the nature of our opponent's deck, we're up against a deck that has a lot of 2-for-1s. And so we have the option of firing off this path on the Snapcaster Mage, and we may want to do that. And so we'll charge our Aether Vial up to 2. Now we've drawn a second path, so we may be forced to path the Snapcaster Mage, even though it's not really what we want to be doing. It can at least stop us from taking a ton of damage at the moment. But this could be bad news. Our opponent's tapping a lot of mana. So, unclear what this is going to be here. But it's probably some sort of threat. So it is Gurmag Angler. It's interesting that our opponent would just go ahead and main phase this Gurmag Angler, because now there's no real reason to go ahead and path the Snapcaster. So let's just go ahead and fire one of the paths on Gurmag Angler. And there's no real need to sacrifice the Tech Edge or the Ghost Quarter, since Grixis Control will sometimes play man lands. So we can just go ahead and wait on these sacrifice lands until our opponent draws something that we really need to remove. But right now, just that lonely Snapcaster Mage is our biggest problem. And if we use the path on the Snapcaster, that would open up the door for something like an additional Gurmag Angler. But since our opponent is casting Inquisition, we're forced to now cast the Path to Exile. And so our opponent's got 2 cards in hand. We're basically running on empty. So it's a matter of if our opponent has something in addition that's going to be a problem for us. Since Aether Vial's at 3, I think we want to just hold it at 3 right now. And just go ahead and proceed with casting the Serra Avenger. And yeah, there's some 3-drops in the deck. There's also a reasonable amount of 2s. The reason why I went ahead and ticked it up to 3 here is because this deck doesn't play that many counterspells. Yes, there are copies of Cryptic that we've seen, but it's more the removal spells that we're worried about, and the counterspells are generally gonna be valuable anyways for our opponent. So, yep, just going to go ahead and get in there, and it looks like that actually worked. That attack worked, which is pretty suspicious. But let's just go ahead and continue with Thalia here, and hope that our opponent just has a lot of lands in hand. So, it's weird that our opponent is just taking this hit. It could be, yes, that we're up against all lands. Other than that, it's hard to actually think about what we would be up against. So, thinking about the Sarin Visions, our opponent did scry a card to the top of their deck. So that's potentially a reason to use our Ghost Quarter if we want to, because we know our opponent put a card on top with the Sarin Visions, so we could use the Ghost Quarter and try to make our opponent shuffle. And so we'll see. Of course, our opponent might elect not to shuffle, but these extra lands aren't really going to help us anyways, so let's just go ahead and fire off a Ghost Quarter on a Water Grave. And we'll see if our opponent does shuffle for a basic or not. It looks like our opponent is correctly not going to search for a basic. So we're going to see what that top card was probably right now. And it's interesting that we're actually in this game because it looked quite bad for us earlier when our opponent was making those attacks with Snapcaster Mage, and I'm not sure that our opponent really timed that Gurmag Angler and Inquisition correctly, because it looked like if our opponent had waited to cast that Gurmag Angler, they could have set up a situation where the Inquisition could have been cast first to actually nab a path, but as it was, we were able to successfully use the Path to Exiles. And so now it looks like Tasigur was the card that was found off that Sarin Vision, so we don't really mind our opponent having back this Inquisition, so that's the first card that's going to go back to our opponent's hand here. And it looks like just a passing of the turn. Okay. So let's see. Blade Splicer was our draw. Blade Splicer is pretty solid here. We have the Aether Vial, so we have no need to hard cast it. So let's just go ahead and swing in with the Serra Avenger. We don't really have any attacks with Athalia available because of the Tasigur here. And now we can just go ahead and Tech Edge one of our opponent's lands just to try to stop them from having more Tasigur activation. So we'll go after the Drowned Catacomb since we already went after Watery Grave earlier. It makes sense. And now just a passing of the turn. And so this is going to be a pretty important turn to see what our opponent can come up with here. The Tasigur is a problem, but not necessarily an immediate problem if there's no answer to the Serra Avenger. But now Snapcaster Mage can flashback terminate to get rid of the Serra Avenger, and there's not really anything we can do about that. So we have the option to put this Blade Splicer into play, and the question is, do we want to do it or do we want to sandbag it? If we put it into play, we have a lot of redraws, so I think we do want to put it into play. If we draw something like a Flicker Wisp or a Path, we're going to be happy that we have this Blade Splicer in play. So let's go ahead and put it in play. We also don't really want to sit around too long when we're up against Tasigur. So Drew Kitchen Finks, which is another 3 we can put into play with Aether Vial. Still, the attacks here aren't particularly profitable. If we had something like Lightning Bolt in our deck, we might want to attack here just because we might get in a couple of damage, which could be relevant, but as is, the idea is just to try to keep these creatures on the table. And we're going to add Kitchen Finks to the board here, and now this may be a turn where we want to think about attacking. Our opponent could have a number of spells. We know about one of them in Inquisition of Kozilek. There are a number of other cards we could be up against. Let's see. Ghost Quarter isn't really going to do much here. Our opponent can activate Tasker multiple times. So I don't think we really want to sit back in this spot. So let's just go ahead and attack, and we'll see what happens. If our opponent has removal, that is of course bad news for us, but at the same time, are we really beating removal anyways? And it actually looks like our opponent didn't have any removal here, which is good news. So yeah, it looks like just it's going to be a couple of Tasker activations at this point. And we have Ghost Quarter available to us. I don't necessarily think we have to use it. Let's go ahead and let our opponent have Stubborn Denial, because we don't have any non-creature spells in hand, and even though it is a hard counter with Tasker on board, we're ahead on board, even though it's by a very small amount. So I actually think we want to go ahead and use the Ghost Quarter just to try to make our opponent's mana a little bit worse. So let's go ahead and blow up this Blood Crypt to try to cut off our opponent's black sources. And it looks like our opponent didn't have a basic to search for, so that ended up working out pretty well. Now we have a bit more of a decision, but I don't think we can really afford to give our opponent back a removal spell. So at that point, I think we just have to give our opponent back Thought Scour. It allows for a card to be drawn, but that's pretty much all it is. Here is 1 mana, draw a card. And it's going to be another activation of Tasker. So I think we want to give our opponent either a Serum Visions here. Yeah, let's go with the Serum Visions. If our opponent's just casting Serum Visions, there's not really too many cards that can hurt us. Even a Lightning Bolt isn't going to do it, because if our opponent Lightning Bolts one of our creatures, we're still getting in for 1 damage with the Blade Splicer. So things have pretty much turned around in our favor at this point. And it could be that our opponent's going to concede the game shortly. That's at least what we're hoping for. The one card that could have really hurt us there was Colligan's Command, to get rid of our Blade Splicer token and the Blade Splicer itself, but it looks like that did not happen, and we were able to take that one. And to be honest, I did not think we were going to win that one, so that is good news. And now on to the sideboard here. So what to board in against Grixis Control? Rest in Peace is actually very good against Grixis Control because of all the Delve cards, the Snapcaster Mages. So we're definitely going to board in the Rest in Pieces. Judge's Familiar is pretty solid. So Crucible of Worlds is another way we can go to sort of strip mine all of our opponent's lands. So I kind of like boarding that one of in. Core Firewalker is another option. Dismember is solid. So it's more about what we can afford to take out. The Angel of Jubilation, while a powerful card, isn't necessarily what we're looking for here because it can just get lightning bolted. We also want to board in Revelark. Revelark is very strong against this deck if it gets into play. So we're going to board that one in. Let's see here. So we've got 64 cards still. we can afford to take out a couple of Aven Mind Sensors because our opponent doesn't actually shuffle their deck that much. Aether Vial is also another card worth considering because our opponent does have Colligan's Command and doesn't have that many counterspells in their deck, so we just want to have a lot of threats. So if we take out the Vials here and add in a different 1-drop in Judge's Familiar, we can make our deck less vulnerable to Colligan's Command. Do we want to take out Spellskite, though? Mirrored Crusader is quite good. So yeah, let's just take out one Leonin Arbiter. This looks pretty good. So let's try this. We're looking again for cards like Blade Splicer and Kitchen Finks, so that we can kind of have our 2-for-1 creatures, which are hard to answer, which is one card from our opponent. And this hand is much better than our opener last game that we mulliganed. This could be an Inquisition. Okay. So, Inquisition is solid. We saw how last game it was a liability for our opponent because not only did it brick once, but our opponent had one in hand at the end of the game. And it's not a card that interacts well with Tasigur, which is why some Grixis control decks don't play Inquisition at all. But it is a lot of times better than Thoughtseize because the life total of the Grixis control player is very important, especially when you're up against the aggressive decks. Our deck is somewhat aggressive, but as you saw last game, we can also play a longer game, and wasn't feeling favored in that game, but still able to take it down. And so Sarah Avenger was the card that was taken just because looks like our opponent has a blocker on the ground in Spellskite, so that makes sense. The Displacer, a lot of these cards are somewhat replaceable in the matchup. If our opponent just uses a Lightning Bolt on basically any of our creatures, then yes, you're allowed to trade your removal spell for our creature, and then it comes down to who draws more gas later in the game. Unfortunately, we didn't draw a Rest in Peace this game, and we're going to have to let that Lightning Bolt resolve. So, we drew another Thalia. So, not too unhappy now that our first Thalia died. But just going ahead and playing the Mirrored Crusader here is pretty attractive, since it's something that our opponent really needs to deal with immediately. So, yeah, let's just go ahead and play Mirrored Crusader. The reason why I say that our opponent needs to deal with it immediately is Spellskite can't block it without dying, and our opponent has a number of black creatures and black removal spells, so unless our opponent has a Snapcaster or to get back the Bolt or a Bolt, the Crusader is just going to be a huge problem. Alternatively, it's just going to die to a removal spell, but I kind of like just running it out aggressively here before our opponent gets a ton going. So we'll see. It could be that our opponent has something like Terminate, but no, it's unfortunately is Snapcaster for Lightning Bolt here, so that's pretty good. That's pretty good. So it looks like we're going to be forced to play a drawn-out game again. Blade Splicer and Thalia, though, do a nice job of holding off Snapcaster Mage. So we're just going to continue getting in with Judge's Familiar. It's not the best win condition in the world, but in a pinch, it'll do the trick. And I like playing the Blade Splicer here just because it puts 2 creatures on the table. So yes, our opponent could have Call against Command, but other than that, we'll be able to block the Snapcaster if any potential attacks are had. And then we're still looking to draw a removal spell like Path to Exile would be nice. We can deploy our Eldrazi Displacer soon enough, and that's another way that we can potentially get through damage, or blinking our own Blade Splicer is another option. But of course, our opponent does have Spellskite, and Spellskite can prevent the Eldrazi Displacer blink, or redirect it, I should say. And so it actually is going to be a Call against Command here, which is pretty unfortunate. Should have sacrificed the Judge's Familiar there to make our opponent pay 1 more, but it's likely not going to matter. So we have the option of just trading our Blade Splicer for the Snapcaster. So we're just going to go ahead and do that. The reason being, as I mentioned before, the Displacer blink on this board isn't particularly important. And Rest in Peace is a nice draw, so let's just go ahead and run out the Rest in Peace to stop our opponent from immediately playing a Delve spell and shut off future Snapcaster Mages. So this was a pretty good draw. If we had had it earlier in the game, it's likely our opponent really couldn't have done anything. As it is, it's still pretty good. Our opponent gets to choose between any of these cards. None of them are great, but they all do something. Looks like it's going to be Thalia hitting the bin. But this is one of the best hate cards against Grixis control. Now something like Gurmag Angler or Tasker, our opponent's going to have to find additional lands in order to just be able to cast them. And so we drew Flicker Wisp for the turn, which I kind of like just go ahead and casting. At this point, it's just a 3/1 flyer, which represents a pretty nice clock if our opponent doesn't have another removal spell for it. And just going to blink out the Ghost Quarter so we have access to it. There's not really any other good blink targets at the moment. And it could be if our opponent's thinking that there is indeed another removal spell in hand. Yep, it's Call against Command, so just going to discard this Leonin Arbiter. And so we have 1 card, our opponent has 1 card, so it's another close game here. Hopefully our opponent's out of removal at this point, and this Eldrazi Displacer is going to go ahead and stick. So let's just play it. Some potential cards our opponent could have that are stuck in hand are the Gurmag Angler. Okay, there's a Snapcaster Mage without any targets. Cryptic is another card our opponent could have. Flicker Wisp is a pretty good draw. It requires our opponent to have another removal spell for it. And we can just blink out the Spellskite and get in for 3 this turn with Eldrazi Displacer. So I think we're slightly ahead if our opponent doesn't play anything here. Otherwise, it's back to even, pretty much, if our opponent has a removal spell for the Flicker Wisp. So, yeah, we're just going to go ahead and take this. We're ahead in the damage race. Revelark is a nice draw. If we draw another land, we'll be able to cast it. So, yeah, just going to go ahead and attack and then blink out the Spellskite. So we're potentially getting in for 6 damage here, which would be a nice chunk for this turn, for sure. And so, yep, our opponent's taking 6, which is good news, but it looks like there is a card our opponent can cast. It's Snapcaster Mage. So, interestingly, our opponent could have held the Snapcaster Mage back, but it looks like the writing's on the wall.